a lot of people have glucose meters at home. It's, a lot of the diabetic population. You can go get it at Walgreens or order it on Amazon. But basically what you're doing is you're just getting a finger prick of your glucose data, and that's just one snapshot in time as compared to the continuous glucose monitor. It's you place it on the back of your arm, and it lasts for 14 days total, and it's consistently monitoring your blood sugar for that 24 hours a day for those full 14 days. So you get to see all that information as opposed to just one snapshot, especially if, not even just looking at fasting levels, if you're looking at how you're responding, so your postprandial or post-meal responses. It's going to be hard to catch the big picture if you're just doing finger pricks, because if you test it before you eat the meal and then you test it an hour later, 2 hours later, you might be missing out on some pretty substantial information.
To find out more about the NutriSense program and my experience and thoughts using the CGM device and app, head over to my website to read my full in-depth review, www.pcosoracle.com/nutrisense-review. The link will also be in the show notes. If you're interested and would like to sign up to the program, NutriSense has kindly provided me with an exclusive promo code. Visit nutrisense.io and use the code PCOSORACLE for $25 off. The link and the discount code will also be available in the show notes. But without further ado, let's jump into the interview with Molly from NutriSense. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to the PCOSORACLE podcast, Molly. I want to start by saying thank you for joining me on this week's episode. I really appreciate you taking the time out of the day to be on the podcast, and I'm really excited to delve into the topic of this week's episode. So episode 86 of the podcast is all about blood sugar. We'll be chatting about the causes of blood sugar fluctuations, signs and symptoms of high and low blood sugar, healthy blood sugar levels. And in the second half of our interview, we'll be talking about NutriSense and their CGM, their continuous glucose monitor. So we'll be looking at what it is, who it's for, what it does, the benefits. So all that's kind of like awesome, interesting stuff. And we'll also be going through my data, which I gained from using the CGM, which was all pretty interesting, to be honest. So I'm super excited. But before we get into that good stuff, can you share a little bit about yourself to our listeners so they can get to know you a little bit?
Of course. Super happy to be here as well. My name is Molly. I am a registered dietitian and I work for NutriSense. So we're just a health technology company and we leverage continuous glucose monitors, or we often refer to it as the CGM, as a way to provide individualized insight into a person's body. So everyone responds differently to specific foods, exercise, stress, and sleep. All these different variables you can see play out in the CGM data. So I personally became interested in all this and began working with NutriSense because I always knew I wanted to work in preventative health. I was always intrigued by how food and lifestyle modifications can play such an integral role in, delaying the disease progression or delaying the onset of a particular disease state. So I always wanted to utilize, food and more of a holistic approach in, working with different individuals. As most dietitians do, a lot of dietitians are working in the field where they're in a clinical setting and seeing, patients who are, in the hospital. So, going through this rotation during my internship program, I realized right away that it's, I wanted to work more on the preventative side of things. With the dietitians work in the hospital setting, we're not getting sufficient amount of time working with the individual in order to promote adequate, habit change. So, we'd only be going in there for, maybe 10, 15 minutes and working with them, but they're not in a good place at this time. And, they're sick, they're in a hospital setting, they're not feeling well. The last thing that they want to do is talk about nutrition. And, as we all know, a lot of it is just behavior change and getting out of old habits. So I just felt that I felt kind of stuck in that area, and I knew I didn't want to work in a clinical setting. I wanted to kind of help someone before they actually got to that point. So that's kind of, and then with blood sugar management, I personally was having my own health issues. I was, had feelings of fatigue, and I had skin issues as well. I later discovered that I had PCOS, or was diagnosed and then was not diagnosed by one doctor. We all know the complications of that. But it was through actually blood sugar monitoring that I discovered, that personal insight into my body. And I recognized that there was something going on, that, I was going to these different doctors and trying to figure out everything. And I knew I didn't feel wholly, I didn't feel good, but there was never a direct answer. And when I started testing my blood sugar, I found that I had poor meal responses, and my fasting glucose levels were a little bit higher than they should have been. So, I was able to recognize these trends. And then finally I was diagnosed with PCOS. So I am, a huge advocate for this, in the fact that, right, there's so much information out there. And at the end of the day, it is purely just individualized. And not that, the continuous glucose monitor is going to be, the answer to everything, but it's just more insight, and it's just one more piece to the puzzle. And it can help someone, get more knowledge about their body, and then they can make more informed decisions on, what to do. So it was really, all these different aspects really got me super into nutrition and blood glucose. And obviously with my diagnosis of PCOS, I, grew that compassion towards understanding how difficult it can be to work around and navigate this in, the conventional, medical system. So, that's kind of how I got into all of this.
That's awesome. I think it's really great how you've kind of gone down that path of helping people prevent developing something. So it's always good to help people avoid having to suffer from symptoms, because preventative is always better than having to find, the treatment and reversing the symptoms. So I think that there needs to be more knowledge to help people avoid, just to improve their diet, their lifestyle, to help them prevent developing, insulin resistance and PCOS and all this kind of stuff that comes with poor nutrition and just poor lifestyle habits. So I think having, more insight and knowledge into how to prevent things like this is just super important. And I think it's great that that's what you're doing. But I think also there was a point I wanted to touch on. So we know that there's a lot of things that can affect blood sugar. So let's kind of touch on, firstly, why is blood sugar something that's so important? Why is it a component that a lot of people should look to addressing maybe first, as rather than looking into buying supplements or into all these other kind of new kind of trends? Why is it a component that's foundational to someone's health?
Good question. Well, if we're looking at blood sugar, and we're looking at the physiological process in the body, if we eat something, for example, it's normal for and expected, to see a response in our blood sugar, especially if that food that, we're eating something that is primarily comprised of carbohydrate. So it's normal to see some oscillation in blood sugar. And what happens is, we eat that food, it's infiltrating into our bloodstream, and then, our pancreas secretes insulin, and that allows for the glucose to enter into our cell and be utilized as energy. So that's the normal physiological process that's going on there. With, anything in the body, we don't want anything to go too far out of range. So the mechanism of blood sugar regulation is tightly regulated. So generally speaking, we have different thresholds that we like to stay within. And if we do have a blood sugar spike, then, we want to stay within a particular threshold. So what we have set currently, at NutriSense, with the research that we now have, is we have that threshold set for everyone that comes into the program at 140. So that's that max peak value that, you know, we want to see our blood sugar staying below that value. There are many people, I have people that are keto or carnivore, or they're following another type of diet, and they might set their peak value to a lower amount, and that's fine. But the whole idea here is with that 140 threshold, it's dependent on the individual, but beyond that, reaching levels beyond that point, we are increasing the susceptibility to inflammation, to cellular damage, to oxidative stress. All of these things are promoters of disease, especially we know with high spikes in blood sugar and glycemic variability, which I'll discuss a little bit later on. We know that this is a huge indicator for cardiovascular health. And when we are having these high glycemic variability or constant swings in your glucose that are occurring repetitively on a daily basis, you know, over long periods of time, this can cause endothelial damage. So that's damage to the heart lining and can cause issues down the road with that. And we know that there's a lot of intersect, you know, if with someone with diabetes is at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. So all these different chronic disease states kind of play into each other. And glucose is a primary regulator in kind of that first, you know, one of the first bits of insight that we can start to detect from a person's metabolism and begin to recognize any sort of sign that's going on. So what we were talking about earlier, we, you know, with my responses in poor glucose responses, this is, you know, I would take this more of as a, you know, a yellow flag. So this is something that's not in to a point where it's extremely alarming. You know, I haven't developed a deep sense of insulin resistance at this time, and we can go more into insulin resistance, but it's more so just a yellow flag. I know that I do not handle carbohydrates well, and I just have to monitor how I consume my carbohydrates and ensure that I'm not having these super high spikes all the time. So it's typically just, you know, you don't have to do complete total diet changes. It's a lot of the times it's these small manipulations that can be super helpful. And I know for the PCOS community, it's very overwhelming and stressful, and there's so many things going on. So sometimes I find that these small minor adjustments are super helpful. But yeah, overall, glucose is, you know, is one of those mechanisms in the body that we want to keep under these regulations. We know that we have regulations for pH balance and temperature. Glucose is one of them, and all these things we want to keep under control. When they start to become out of range, that's when, you know, minor stresses come about in the body and inflammation can be imposed on the body, and that's when the progression of disease then ensues. So
yeah,
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, I've got a few questions I wanted to ask from that point that you just said. The first one is, so what are some of these high blood sugar signs that people should look out for when they do have one of these like high spikes?
Exactly. So I think, first of all, just to clarify what, you know, maybe what to expect to see from a CGM data when you're eating something. So typically we're going to respond, most people are going to respond primarily to carbohydrates, because this is when it's broken down in the body, the glucose is the constituent that's absorbed into the bloodstream and causes that rise. Protein does so to some extent, and then fat does not as much. So but they all work together to help regulate a response or, you know, delay a response or anything from that aspect. But say you eat like a banana, for example, you might have a high blood sugar spike. Everyone responds differently. So say myself, for example, and I spike to 140. And the idea is that we don't want to stay in these higher ranges for long periods of time, because as I expressed earlier, that's when we're reaching these levels of, you know, increased susceptibility to these adverse effects that can promote disease progression down the road. So if I do spike, I want my levels to come back down within the 2 to 3 hour period, because this is demonstrating that I have good insulin sensitivity and I'm able to tolerate this meal well. So I did spike, but my body's able to bounce back and get my levels back down to baseline in that 2 to 3 hour period. If we're looking at a more abnormal response, this would be something where, you know, your levels spike high beyond threshold, say maybe in the 170 range, and then your levels are sitting in that 170 range for extended periods of time that take a while to come back down to baseline. So if you're thinking about it, it's your body's having more difficulty processing this meal, and your levels are sitting in those high ranges for longer periods of time, which is just inducing your susceptibility to issues down the road. So we're looking at different responses in the body, but there's definitely ways to navigate all this. And I don't know if you have any questions from any of that, but we can go.
So if someone doesn't, let's say someone who's not got a CGM and they have like a really high response, how would they know, like, oh, hang on a minute, I've had like too many carbs, let's say, I've had a high spike, like how would they feel? Like, just so people,
more like, yeah, like symptomatic. Well, it's truly dependent. Someone can have a high spike and truly notice nothing. They may not even feel it. There's no other, you know, issues going on. I know personally, when I have a high blood sugar spike, my heartbeat is very fast. So I know I have increased heartbeat, and through my experience in working with other individuals, they experience this as well. Some people might get a headache or fatigue or something in that realm. It's with, you know, it's truly dependent, and there's no overt issues that are going to be across the board for everyone. But, you know, I think rapid heartbeat or any sort of abnormal symptoms after eating might be demonstrative of, you know, high spike or a very low spike in blood sugar. So we see this trend often on the CGM as well, where your blood sugar dips very low. So generally speaking, the threshold that we're staying in, we have the low threshold at 70 milligrams per deciliter, and then we have the upper threshold at 140. So if you think about it, like throughout the day, we're trying to stay within this threshold. And 70 is just what we have preset as well. I have people who sit in the 60s all day and they feel completely fine. So it's truly dependent on the person. However, if I'm ever seeing a low glucose dip like that, I'm always going to ask someone, you know, how they're feeling in that situation. Typically, they'll, you know, a common symptom of hypoglycemia that you'd see is, you know, headache or extreme fatigue, hunger, dizziness, which are symptoms that accompany that. So if I do see that in the data, I always just ask whoever I'm working with if they are experiencing any of those issues, and then we can kind of work around, you know, maybe some other issues that are going on there.
So would anything, I guess, below 60 be too, like, low blood sugar?
Yeah, so I will deem it as an actual, you know, hypoglycemic issue if it's persistent and there were symptoms that are accompanying that low dip. But for non-diabetics, it's something that I often see, and it's not always associated with adverse symptoms. So
all right, cool. So yeah, I definitely, like, from using the CGM and just from personal experience, without even using the monitor, I could tell that when my blood sugar does dip, I always feel like super tired. I just want to take a nap, and I'm just like, yeah, blood sugar issues.
Totally. And that's awesome insight, because I know a lot of people, they might feel that, but then in your perspective, actually putting on the CGM and then seeing your blood sugar low, and then, you know, actually feeling that way, you're like, okay, that makes sense. It's satisfying in a way to see that there's something actually going on and it's not just in your head.
Yeah, definitely. So how long is there, like, I don't know, like estimate or like an average that people could say for how long it takes for someone to develop insulin resistance or like diabetes after having like that persistent blood sugar kind of fluctuations? Is there like an average time that it develops?
Well, insulin resistance is a very complex physiological issue that's going on within the body, and it develops over, it can be a decade where, this is developing. Again, I'll just use the example of myself where, I've discovered that, I have this poor tolerance. It might not be until 20 years from now or 10 years from now that I'll actually, if I were to be persistent with eating, a very high carb, highly processed diet with lack of exercise, and I'm chronically stressed out all the time, if all these variables are, going into this whirlwind 10, 20 years down the road, I may be at that point in time where I have a more advanced state of insulin resistance. So in my mind, I'm working way in advance to help regulate and control my body through stress management, what I'm eating, exercise, sleep quality. So it's definitely something that progresses over a long period of time. And I know with females with PCOS, since there is, hormones involved, and, and I know not everyone with PCOS is insulin resistant, so only about 70%, are insulin resistant. So it's truly dependent. And I think that's a good thing as well for this community, because, they might go into their doctor and their doctor might tell them, oh, you are insulin resistant, you can't have carbohydrate, you cannot eat this, whatever it is. But it might not be the case. If the doctor runs more diagnostic tools, diagnostic tests behind assessing whether or not they're insulin resistant, then absolutely. But I think the CGM is a great tool for deciphering whether or not this is a trend that's working with you, because again, everything is individualized, and it is hard to manage PCOS symptoms. And if you're told by your doctor you can never have a carbohydrate again, that can be extremely frustrating. And I think, the CGM can provide more insight there and even give you more leniency in what food choices you can actually make.
Yeah, I know it's so frustrating sometimes when you go to the doctor and they're like, yeah, you've got PCOS, and it's just like straight up, like cut the carbs. It's not like they don't even like run any tests to be like, okay, you are actually insulin resistant. Most of the time they just say to treat it, cut carbs, lose weight, like all this like unnecessary stuff, and it's just like it doesn't help. So
Exactly.
what tests can people, I guess, if their doctor's just not running specific tests like insulin resistance to check for insulin resistance, what tests can people ask for to test for insulin resistance?
Yeah, it's definitely more difficult, and some of the most accurate ones are like ones that they would only use in like a clinical study or something like along that line. But I would say, just from my experience and what most doctors will do, is just getting a fasting insulin. So when you're in a fasted state, where are your insulin levels at? Generally speaking, you want to be, for optimal levels, is like 2 to 9 range. Beyond that, so I would say anywhere in the 20s is where I would start to see signs of, potential insulin resistance at play. So there are nuances to the A1C test, and we know fasting values that you'd get in a lab is just one instant in time, but I usually just have them look at A1C, fasting glucose, fasting insulin. Those are all labs that most doctors will agree to, and I feel like they're the easiest to get to. So I think just the fasting insulin is at least a good start there. And then looking at the CGM data, of course, the CGM is not a diagnostic tool. We're never going to diagnose anyone with anything, but it's helpful to see your responses and the severity of your insulin resistance if you do have it. So
Interesting, yeah. So we kind of touched on like carb tolerance. But actually, before we touch on carb tolerance, what other causes would there be? Because we touched on how diet can affect blood sugar, and how basically unbalanced meals of having, like, let's say you just have a carb kind of meal with no like not enough protein or no protein, or it's just there's no balance in your meal, so it causes those spikes. What other potential causes are there? Whether it's also other kind of dietary stuff or other lifestyle things, what other stuff could cause
abnormal blood sugar control? Exactly. Well, we can look at many different things. I think insulin resistance, as we were talking about, is a huge thing. And it's like, you might not be fully insulin resistant at some point, but you could be in the process of developing that. It can be totally genetic. With, if you have diabetes running in your family, you might just be, demonstrating this intolerance to carbohydrate earlier on. With gut health, this can play a role in how we're processing our food and carbohydrate as well. So gut health is always something that you would want to look at as well. And low grade inflammation and chronic inflammation are all things like with PCOS that could be going on there. So glucose is not always going to be the answer. It's just one piece of that puzzle, but there are so many working parts. And as I'm sure it's trying to figure out the root cause and what's going on within the body that's promoting these issues.
Yeah. So let's talk more about food and the whole diet. So one common question people always ask is, if they have like the same meal at one time, like for lunch, and then they have the same meal at dinner, why might the blood glucose readings be like not the same? Like there's like drastic difference maybe.
Yeah, so we see this all the time in glucose data. It's one of the primary trends that I see, but it's the same idea of like circadian rhythms. So they dictate all the hormone fluctuations and everything going on in our body, not just the sleep-wake cycle. If, as you were saying, it's very common to see a more pronounced blood sugar response to a meal, in particular to carbohydrates later on in the evening. And this is because we're from a physiological standpoint, we're not able to process foods as well. And that's because if you're looking, from an evolutionary perspective, right? We, at this time when it's dark out, we're supposed to be sleeping and resting, and it's not a time that we're supposed to be eating and metabolizing food. So we do have more difficulty processing meals. And with that said, someone might try out, say they eat a sweet potato, at 10 o'clock at night, and they have a poor response to it. That doesn't mean that you can never have a sweet potato again, right? My first offer would be, let's try to have it earlier on in the day and see if you're able to tolerate it better. And most of the time you are. If not, then we can work on meal composition, adding in protein first. And that's very helpful in regulating a glucose response, and then working on carb amount and just portion sizes with carbohydrate, because sometimes or oftentimes we overdo it on the carbohydrates. So it doesn't mean that you can't have it. There's many different ways that we can kind of work around that. But yeah, back to the protein pairing, and this is obviously widely known in the PCOS community, but it's truly something that I can actually see the data, and it is very effective in helping modulate that glucose response. And it totally depends, because I find that some people, peanut butter might work for some people, but for another person, it might not be enough. They might need more substance or a higher amount of protein at the meal. So maybe just 2 hard-boiled eggs before they eat their carbohydrate to help regulate that response. So I think experimenting around with that is helpful for sure. But yeah, it's definitely that protein pairing is super effective, and just getting to the point of the fact that if you do eat something, if you do try out the CGM and it's later on in the evening, it's normal that our bodies are going to have more difficulty processing it. So, something that I might see is if someone eats, that a larger meal that's rich in carbohydrates later on at night, then, they might have a huge blood sugar spike, and then they might see their blood sugar rise and then stay elevated for the duration of their sleep. And what I find is that some people will have sleep disruption, and their quality of sleep is not as good, and their glucose levels are rising, and they're tossing and turning all night. And then, all that, there's all that disruption right there. So if you do, if you are testing out the CGM and see that high glucose spike at night, it might just mean that you're someone that needs to focus more so on the meal timing and meal composition later on at night. So even trying to eat at least 3 hours before bed, eating your last meal by at least 6 p.m. is my general recommendation, but for some people, they need to push it back earlier. It's truly dependent, but for the most part, it should help to just push it back to earlier, have that set time, and let your body digest its food, before you fall asleep. Otherwise, once you fall asleep, it has difficulty processing.
So if you have, let's say you wake up with high blood sugar, what are the ways you can do to help lower it?
Yeah. I would say for the most part, because a lot of people will wake up with higher blood sugar levels, especially if they were increased from something that you were doing the night before, or if you had poor sleep. So if you wake up and your levels are high, I would say going for a walk is probably the best thing that you can do. So low intensity exercise, whether that be through walking, hiking, I see it on the elliptical sometime, anything that's super moderate is going to cause that dip in glucose, and it helps dispose of any excess glucose. So if you see those high levels that are kind of sitting there overnight, then going for a walk when you wake up in the morning can help release that. I've also found that if someone eats something, or if there's any sort of stimulant coming in, coffee, food, walk, it depends. Sometimes it doesn't work for anyone, or none of those things work for someone, but for the most part, I think those are very effective. And even if you're having a blood sugar spike and you notice that your levels spike very high, walking after you eat, again, can help dispose of that excess glucose far more efficiently than if you were to just sit and lay down on your couch and watch TV for the rest of the night. So that's why walking is huge, and doing it after a meal is very effective in regulating that glucose response.
Yeah. So if someone does see a spike and in the morning, would you advise them to be oh no, I can't eat anything, and just fast until it dips?
Actually, no, because I would say, just from anecdotal evidence on a few things that I've seen, your body can become almost stressed when you are in a fasted state. So someone can fast and do intermittent fasting and their body responds fine, but other people, they might be fasting, and if their glucose levels are persistently high, and I'm thinking it's from being in a fasted state, then sometimes you'll see that they eat something and then their glucose levels immediately drop. So if I take my mom, for example, she wears a CGM, and she has that issue where her levels are just increased overnight. So her combination that works for her is a high protein meal and then going for a walk in the morning, and it kind of releases that tension and then brings her glucose levels down earlier. Because in my head, if you don't do anything and then your levels are just going to stay persistently high, that's higher levels of glucose that you can bring down sooner rather than later. So if we do see that trend, then we'll work around different experiments to try to control those levels.
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's a good idea if you do have a spike to always have a balanced breakfast, like not to skip breakfast. Like everyone's always like, skip breakfast, you don't need it. It's just like, no, I feel like it is like the most important meal. Have a balanced meal, and it kind of like evens things out. And just like throughout the day, just make sure you have a balanced meal. That's like the focus. But also, I guess touching on fasting, which is like very popular in the PCOS community, and it's just like a trend everyone's kind of like jumping on because obviously like one of the main things people follow it for is generally for weight loss. Also, there's been like evidence for insulin resistance, but I think the whole thing about how it's a kind of a stressful thing on the body. Let's kind of like touch on your opinion on the keto diet, carnivore, and just generally like low carb. What's your kind of opinion, your stance on this kind of stuff?
Exactly. So I'll first start with the fasting. So intermittent fasting is a huge thing right now, and even more extended fasts. With intermittent fasting, I would say for the most part, I'm not going to see that super high stress response. It's usually delicate enough and not enough of time spent in that fasting period as opposed to the fed period where that the cortisol and the abnormal effects are ensuing. However, it doesn't mean that it cannot happen for someone. I definitely see it more with like extended fast. If I see levels fluctuating and they're consistently high, then that's an obvious sign to me that their body's having difficulty with that more extended fast. I find with females in general, due to all of our hormonal interplay of everything, we just generally have more difficulty with fasting. Men, I typically will find have a better tolerance for it. But again, it's something that is consistently being thrown in our face in the health community. And, it might not work for everyone. But for the most part, I think it's a great tool to, for weight loss and with insulin resistance. So I think it's a great thing to try out. And I usually don't see many adverse effects with most individuals. It's more rare and more towards the extended fasting that I would see more of an issue. That being said, I have had a lot of success with more extended fasting, but more in the severe insulin resistance in the diabetic community. Not as much with PCOS. I haven't really, worked that much with someone with PCOS and doing more extended fasting. But with keto in carnivore, as you were discussing, again, I think that, if you have that personality type and you are severely insulin resistant, I do think that, a keto diet can be helpful for you. However, there are some people who actually need that carbohydrate intake and it helps them. So I don't like to make that blanket statement of, keto is going to help everyone, because it's not. It can successfully help someone. And if they feel ultimately better on it and they're able to improve their labs and they feel good, then that's something that's effective and it's going to work for them. But I'm just not going to drill it into someone who that's not their personality type and they want to still incorporate carbohydrates into their diet. It's just more so not like an end all be all. It's just hopefully providing more insight with the CGM data. If they are responding very poorly to carbohydrate, then I find that a lower carb diet is very helpful in, even monitoring how someone's feeling and everything going on. And ultimately, it's helpful in regulating blood sugar control. With carnivore, I think it's helpful for someone who has more autoimmune or digestive issues. But personally, I just think that there's definitely more qualms that can come along with it. So I definitely encourage people to try to incorporate more carbohydrates. But I do trust that, I work with everyone on, from their standpoint, and like they've all been through their own journey and they've been through the ringer with so many different things. So I'm trying to just understand them from their point of view. So I never want to back down on anything that they've found that has worked for them, because I know how complicated it can be. So I'm always just going to support that person and what they feel works for them. Mm-hmm. But I've seen kind of across the board different effects from all the different things. So that's why I'm largely focused on individuality and what works for that specific person.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like all you can do is provide people with information until they can make their own decision. And sometimes when you've just kind of gone through a lot and you find something that works, you kind of you just do it, and then maybe eventually down the line, if you find out it doesn't work anymore, for example, then like you might be a little bit more open to realizing like carbs aren't the enemy. But ultimately, like just to summarize, like we're trying to say like carbs aren't bad, because I feel like there's been such demonization on carbs as like carbs called this and that. And it's just like it's just another food group. All you have to do is like, make sure that when you eat them with you just balance your meals, and you exercise so you can, increase your carb tolerance and all this kind of stuff. I feel like before people just demonize it and avoid it, that they try to do stuff to help their body respond a little bit better before you just completely say, yeah, no, these are bad. And just like, I feel like there's just so many foods and so many food groups that they've been said it's bad, and it's just really not. It's just, number one, it's like how food has been like created. Like, for example, wheat is like not how it used to be back in the day. It's like fortified and it's sprayed with like glyphosate and all this kind of stuff. It's just not pure, it's not natural anymore. So like people tend to experience certain things not really because of the food, it's just how it's been made and how it's processed and how we're like cooking it, or all this kind of stuff like affects how a food is, like, so there's so much stuff that
I know it's super complicated, and that's why I'm super excited about this technology, obviously, and hopefully the more technologies that are going to come into play, because obviously, right, all the information out there, it is so complicated, and people are still just sitting here confused. They don't know what to do. They feel that they're just confused. So I feel like
information overload.
It's totally just information overload. So I hope that through these technologies, everyone can begin to just at least get peace of mind with what they're eating. And if they don't want to eat a keto diet, and they're being told from all different angles that that's the only thing that's going to help them with their PCOS or anything else that they're dealing with, then that can be devastating in the fact that then you feel like you don't want to do anything, and then who knows what track then you'll go off of. So it's finding common ground, and habit change takes a long time, and it's just that knowledge and experimentation and seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, which is going to help in the long run. So
definitely. So let's kind of move on to like the second part of the interview and talk more about the CGM and the NutriSense, and I'll pull up some of my like data as well. But I guess let's like recap. Who is NutriSense? Let's touch again. What is the CGM and how can it help people? Is it for specific people? Is it for everyone?
Cool. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, NutriSense is just a health technology company, and then we use a continuous glucose monitor as a way to just get more insight into how someone is responding to specific variables. What it is you basically just apply the sensor on the back of your arm. It can either be the right or left arm, but once you hook it up, you scan the sensor into our app, and all your glucose data then shows up in the app on the graph, and you can see all the variations that is occurring in the app. So you can see your response to exercise or sleep or the different food responses. You also, if you sign up for the program and you get the CGM, you get paired with one of our dietitians, and all that communication is done through the in-app chat. But we are here to help you analyze your data. If you have any questions, you can ask us questions, and then we'll also be reviewing and checking on you and providing any insights on what we're seeing in the glucose data. So if we're looking at, someone's probably asking like the difference between a continuous glucose monitor and a glucose meter. A lot of people have glucose meters at home, it's, a lot of the diabetic population. You can go get it at Walgreens or order it on Amazon. But basically what you're doing is you're just getting a finger prick of your glucose data, and that's just one snapshot in time as compared to the continuous glucose monitor. It's you place it on the back of your arm, and it lasts for 14 days total, and it's consistently monitoring your blood sugar for that 24 hours a day for those full 14 days. So you get to see all that information as opposed to just one snapshot, especially if, not even just looking at fasting levels, if you're looking at how you're responding, so your postprandial or post-meal responses, it's going to be hard to catch the big picture if you're just doing finger pricks, because if you test it before you eat the meal and then you test it an hour later, 2 hours later, you might be missing out on some pretty substantial information. But with the continuous glucose monitor, you get to see those full trends play out, and you get to see how long it takes your body to come back to baseline value. You get to see the overnight trends in your glucose, which are something that you would miss out with the glucose meter. So there's definitely a lot of benefits to actually wearing the CGM.
Yeah, so let me try and share my screen and pull up this. Is it working? I think it's all right. So can you see this?
I see that yes, I can.
All right. So I screen recorded some of the data and some of the little explanations of what things mean, because there's a lot of data obviously, and it can be really overwhelming. So I guess we can go through my data, go through what what data it gives you, and just see what we can find. And for anybody who's listening, just literally just listening, if you want to look at the data, then head over to my YouTube channel. Have it in the show notes, but just to
maybe you can I think it's helpful if you just point out, maybe you ask if you have any particular questions that you want to point out about a specific response or any sort of trend, then I can help you walk through.
I guess let's just talk through why there's massive spikes and then it dips all the way down to 94, and then it explain let me just pause it here. So here we have all of the food, and then we have scores here in green circles. Sometimes I think they can be in yellow or red. So I guess we can just explain what those numbers mean.
Cool. Yeah, maybe I wonder if you can expand. Oh, you probably can't because it's a screen recording. But basically, anytime you log a meal, so you can see all those red dots that are on the graph, those are all meals. And then the blue is just an activity. But if you log a meal, then we have a meal score. So you can see for your dinner, you got a 9. For your snack.
Zoomed in a bit. I think it went too much.
It expanded a little bit.
Way too
much. There's different metrics that we're looking at that all comprise that meal score. So how high you're spiking, how many points you're jumping, how long it takes to recover. So there are many working parts, and there's some nuances to it. So the score is not always going to be exactly perfect, but it's just something that can help the member on their aspect to get a better sense of, what's good and, what's bad. So so we're looking at peak adaptability. So how many points your glucose is spiking, and that plays into, when we're looking at the data, that's the delta value, and that plays into glycemic variability. And glycemic variability is those consistent swings in glucose that are occurring. If they're occurring on a persistent basis, then this can impose more issues down the road. But with what you're saying here, you can see your levels were at 110 overnight. So that's a little bit higher than what we would deem as optimal. Keep in mind that we don't have as much research on overnight values, but in general, it's common to see an increase overnight as you're sleeping. But we can see that increase, but we just don't want it to go beyond higher levels. So in your case, you're around 110. Generally speaking, I want to stay an average or certain peaks below 105 milligrams per deciliter, it's likely because, there could be a hormonal issue, which, if you do have PCOS, that plays in. And also if there's persistent stress or poor sleep or what you ate the night before, all of these things can play a role and be a reasoning behind this higher overnight values. I can say that overnight values and fasting values take a lot more time, persistence, determination, and concentration to find improvement with. The post-meal responses, you can make small manipulations and you can see changes almost immediately, but those fasting and overnight values, they take, anywhere from, if you're being consistent, it depends on the situation, but it can take a long period of time, 3-6 months or a year to see improvements there. But it's normal then to see levels go down during the day. You can see with the meals that you did have, these are very normal, healthy responses. You can see you didn't spike very high, you only spiked to about 100, and then your levels came back down quickly. Here are the same situation. So whatever it was that you were eating, these are healthy, normal responses. So if you want to, I don't know if you have any questions about this day or if you want to go into the next day.
We can go into the next day. Let's see. See if I can all right, let's look at this day.
Cool.
So basically I was trying to experiment with a lot of trying, desserts and stuff, which usually I don't always have dessert, but just to see how does my body respond if I have a chocolate or an ice cream after dinner. I was trying to do it kind of straight after food-ish, just so it doesn't at least I've had my protein, you can kind of balance it out.
Exactly. You actually that's not that poor of a response to ice cream. So that's actually the fact that you ate that at night, and that's just an influx of sugar. That's the fact that you didn't spike beyond threshold. You only spiked to 120, and then your levels, you can see it did take a little bit longer, but that's normal in the fact that, it was at night and you have that decreased insulin sensitivity. So it's normal to see that longer processing. So that actually isn't a super poor response. And the fact you had potatoes earlier and you were able to tolerate that well, even though it was later on at night. So I would say that's a good thing. And that's encouraging to know, because, that you're not having these super high responses at that time.
Let's see this day. All right, here I this is a day, this is another day. There's quite a few spikes here. Okay,
let's see what we had. So it looks like, again, you did have spikes, but this is not what maybe insulin resistance would look like, because although you are spiking, you're coming back down quickly. So your body's able to adapt to the meals that you're consuming, and you don't seem to have a super high intolerance to carbohydrate.
All right, so let's look at this this kind of little screenshot of all this kind of stuff. So peak exposures to biliary recovery. I guess we can touch on, because this was it wasn't it's a balanced meal. It's got protein and your carbs and fat. So I guess we can touch on when people have spaghetti and bolognese, or everybody's scared of eating pasta and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see that your peak was at 135. So that's still below the threshold. Your delta was 50, which is a little bit higher, generally speaking. So that's the little green triangle right there. Generally speaking, for an optimal response, below 30 is more what we're looking for. But anywhere in that 30 to 50 range, I deem as okay. And then beyond that point, obviously if something's more in the 100 range, that's a poor delta. That's a huge swing. So you're just kind of at that moderate threshold for being at 50. All that 2 hour, you were 7 points away from your pre-meal value at the 2 hour mark. So you recovered quickly. Mm-hmm. Even though you were 7 points away, you were basically there. And then the squiggly blue line right there, you're at 58. That's just the area under the curve. Typically, below 50 is okay. An area under the curve is just looking at like the time it takes from pre-meal to get back down. So this is, not a terrible response. You can see you did spike, but you were basically back down in that 2-hour period. So you were able to adapt and respond. Something that might be helpful here, if someone is eating the gluten-free pasta with, a bolognese sauce, meal sequencing helps. So again, with the protein, like even if you're just eating a meal and it's not just a snack, trying to eat the protein from your meal first can help regulate the response. So I know it's hard sometimes with combination foods, but I always try to do that the best I can because I know it really helps when monitoring or regulating my blood sugar.
Awesome. So I guess if someone saw a spike like that, they shouldn't be like, oh, I can't eat pasta again.
Definitely not. I would, and even this is a perfect example. Probably if you went for a walk after, it probably would have come back down a lot faster. Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that you can never have it again.
Yes.
We didn't have any like super poor responses, which is good.
Yeah. This is like just having 2 pieces of dark chocolate. I guess pretty decent. nothing too shocking.
Yeah. So you hit 120, basically back down within the 2-hour mark. Your delta was 30, so again, that's more optimal. So this is a perfectly normal response.
Yeah, and I had this at 8:30 p.m. So I had dinner at 5:50, and then I had this quite like a couple of hours after my food. So,
well, you can see actually. So there are some nuances because only the meal score is looking at the 2-hour time frame, and you can see if you had it at 8:30. So you were having some increase in glucose after that. It could have been a combination of what you ate earlier and then that dark chocolate, but you see that your blood sugar was still in a little bit higher ranges, and it's not worrisome, but you can just, pay attention to those trends and see if anything's impacting your sleep or anything at all. So that's a good one to look at. Because that's the idea of reactive hypoglycemia. So typically, if you have, a larger intake of carbohydrate, it might spike and then it might dip low like that, and that happens all the time. And more so if you see that low dip, then I don't know if you remember what happened on this day because it was back in July, but if you felt any symptoms that accompanied this response, that would be insightful for sure.
I remember if I had like some dried fruit.
Yeah.
There was a day I had like dried fruit. I had figs, I think, and it spiked so much, and I was like, whoa.
I know, it's crazy. That's why that protein pairing comes into play there, right?
Trying to find when I went out for dinner for my birthday. I ate later than usual, and I had quite a bit of different foods, and I had some alcohol. I can't remember what day it was. It was like, oh, here it is. Duck on waffle.
Right, so that's a good point to bring up. So with alcohol, it looks like you just had 1 glass of wine. Typically, what happens when you have alcohol, like wine or any sort of well drink, your body is going to prioritize breaking down the alcohol before the other food. So generally speaking, you did have a little bit of a spike. So we still did see that, but oftentimes I'll see that spike is kind of not there and it shows up later. So if someone falls asleep, then they might have higher overnight and higher fasting levels. That's a common trend that I see. But yeah, you can see with the different foods that you did have, you had some dessert, some apple mousse. This meal sounds phenomenal.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, good birthday meal. But yeah, you still did have a spike. And again, it's later on in the evening when we have more difficulty processing foods. And of course, this is your birthday, you're, enjoying and having a good time, but it's good to see, what's actually going on. And here you did spike to 140. So that might've been your highest spike, but again, you have good recovery. So you're always coming back down quickly, which is a good sign.
What we got here? So yeah, here I had like a snack before I went. I just had a simple orange just to see if I ate through on its own, like, what would happen. So it was like
you had a great response to that.
It's like straight 10s.
I know. That's amazing. Satisfying to see. So even without the protein, you can do the fruit and feel fine.
So yeah, here was like I made a homemade cookie to test things out. So that was a pretty bad response.
Yeah, it's a good example. So you can see the 2 hour, you were still 39 points away from pre-meal value. So you were just it took a little bit more time to process this meal, and you spiked to 148, which is beyond the threshold. But yeah, definitely a less optimal response.
Yeah.
Again, doesn't mean you can never have the cookie. Maybe it's helpful if you eat your dessert after a full meal, because you have that protein and fat and other food in your body, and then you can have the dessert, and it usually doesn't have as much of an impact. So I think that's helpful.
Guess all this stuff is pretty fine. Trying to find if I can find that. Okay, this is like Brazil nuts and dates. I didn't have a bad, but I remember I had where is it? I've seen that one already. Okay, this was I had milk and half a cookie, and it wasn't a bad response.
Oh, cool. Yeah, was it a different cookie, or
No,
was it the same
one? I just had half instead of a whole cookie. I had half.
There you go.
With a cup of milk, and I think I had this quite late actually. What time did I have? It was
actually amazing. So that's a perfect example of working on the manipulation, so you can see.
9:27 at night.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm hungry, I want to eat something. I was like, oh screw it, I'll just have this cookie and some milk.
So the protein from the milk probably helped, and just a smaller portion. Sometimes you just need a smaller portion than eating the full cookie. So, and I think you can be equally as satisfied. So I think that's a good little tip for you to know.
Here I had this was when I feel like I had these gluten-free like cereal biscuits or something, because I think like gluten-free now because I had like high thyroid antibodies, and I think I get like a reaction from gluten. So I saw these and I was like, screw, I'm just gonna give these a try. But I think I had them with 2 boiled eggs, and I must have had the dried fruit here or something, the dried figs here, I think. But this was a bad response. I think it was, I should have wrote the thing, but sometimes I'm just like, I just can't remember.
I know, it's hard. That's why
you were 162, damn.
Yeah, 162.
And that was the highest.
The recovery was slow, and looks like you spiked 59 points, so all good to see.
It's quite interesting though, just to
kind of go through everything, for sure. And hopefully, actually, for whoever's watching the YouTube channel, it's helpful to see all the visuals.
Yeah.
To see what's going on, and everyone responds differently to everything, so it's super fascinating for sure.
I guess we could touch on some of this analytics, like what does all this like daily average, meals average, glucose like? So
basically, meals average is just looking at the different meals that you had. So as you saw, some of them were scored 4, some were scored 10. So it's just averaging out, and you can do it this is for July 23rd. You can do it based off of the last week, last 14 days, last 30 days. your daily average is just taking into consideration your daily score. There's a lot of analytics within the app. And if you're working with your dietitian, then we help you to understand all that if you are curious and you ask about it. Standard deviation, your standard deviation for that day was at 14, which is very optimal. In general, that standard deviation is our measure of glycemic variability. And for optimal ranges, we want to stay below 14. Anywhere from 14 to 20 is okay. And then beyond 20 is what is, more issues might be going on with your glucose that we can kind of consider. Mean is just your average glucose. So you're at 104 for that day. Generally speaking, we want to stay below 105, but some people, are trying to optimize and they like to stay in the 90s or the 80s, and that's fine too. But generally speaking, below 105 is okay. I don't know if you think there's some below there.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, so you can look at your morning average. So it'll show your max spike again for that day, for the 7-day period, for the 14-day period. So you can see the app is picking up on all the information and providing more concise analytics as to what's going on. So you can see, in the last week, what was the highest that my glucose spiked? You can see on this day, your highest spike was 117. So that's pretty solid. And your sleep average is around 106. So it's a little bit higher than we're looking for. Again, we're looking for 105. And then your morning average is just looking at your average morning glucose, and you're at 106. Generally speaking, we want to stay in that 70 to 90 range. But there's many implications that can be going on here. And I focus more so on postprandial responses as opposed to fasting. As I have mentioned, it takes a longer period of time to work on those levels and more consistency. So I think of those glucose spikes and the variability as something you can fix sooner. So yeah, basically within the app, you can always click on the little eye icons and it shows up just a brief description if you're confused at anything. But again, the dietitian can help work through all these questions with you, because we understand that there's a lot going on in the app and we don't expect people to fully understand glucose data and how it applies to what's going on and with their health goals and everything. So we are just here to help you assess and analyze, and I feel like it's very useful for most people. So
And I guess if anyone's following the keto diet, I guess this will be useful. The ketone.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you measure your ketones, so if you use something like the Keto Mojo, you can sync that into the NutriSense app. So basically it just consolidates all the information into our app, so you can kind of track everything, in one place. But keep in mind that the glucose meter that we're using is not actually picking up on ketones. We're only picking up the glucose data, and then we just have that portion in the app for ketone monitoring.
Awesome. So yeah, that was all super interesting. I learned quite a lot just to experiment, because obviously I wouldn't usually just have a straight cookie on its own, but it was just interesting to see, just by eating that, how does my body utilize and use that sugar, just out of curiosity.
I always encourage experimentation, just at least in the first few weeks when you're using the sensor, just even if it is out of your norm, if you're curious, because every once in a while you might have something like that. So it's just interesting to see how your body responds based off of whatever circumstance you're in. So I'm all about the experiments.
Yep. Awesome. I'm gonna stop sharing this screen. Okay. Yep, that worked. I guess we can finish up our questions. So, I think we touched on this, but if we haven't, you can just touch on it. But I'm not sure I think we have. So when we're using the CGM, what are some red flags or signs that you're like looking out for? So I think we said if it spikes above like 140, if it goes really high, and if it doesn't come down within the 2-hour range and it lasts kind of longer, I guess, is there anything else we can like touch on here?
For insulin resistance, correct? Yeah, so generally the main trends that I'm looking for when I'm looking for insulin resistance is what you were saying, like if it's spiking high above threshold on a consistent basis and then staying in those elevated ranges for an extended period of time and taking a longer time to come back down to baseline. So it's typically, beyond 4 or 5 hours, if you eat something and your level are still in those higher ranges, that's going to be more indicative of insulin resistance at play. Higher overnight values can be a sign of that, or just higher baseline values in general. So it doesn't, mean that there's, if you have high overnight values, you have an advanced state of insulin resistance. It just means that there could be slight levels of insulin resistance at play there. But yeah, generally I'm just looking at baseline fasting and then recovery time on how you're responding to different foods.
Awesome. So I guess we can wrap up the episode with like some quick tips and steps our listeners can use to start working on their blood sugar and help the response. If they end up, either way, if they have the CGM or if they don't have the CGM, like what things can people do to help blood sugar balance?
Exactly. I think for sure, walking, as I mentioned before, even if you're not wearing the monitor, going for a walk after your meals at night, just to help dispose of any glucose if your levels are sitting higher, going for a walk in the morning, just to get your body moving, being active throughout the day, even just not sitting at your desk all day. I know we all do this. We're all sitting at our computers all day long. So just being mindful of getting up and walking around or standing up. Even standing up can be helpful as opposed to just sitting and lying down all day. Protein pairing is huge. Food quality. If you do notice that or think that you might be slightly intolerant to carbohydrate, then doing a workout before you eat a carbohydrate is very helpful. So in that post-workout phase, we are more tolerant of carbohydrates. So I'll find that eating a carbohydrate during that time can be tolerated more effectively. So I think that's a good tip. Also, I find that apple cider vinegar is actually very effective too. I kind of always thought that it was like something that was all over the place, but the pills don't really work. But the actual apple cider vinegar helps if you drink like 2 tablespoons with water. I know it's not the best tasting thing, but it's helpful if you have that before a meal to help modulate that glucose response. So, if you are someone who's intolerant to carbs or has more difficulty processing them, doesn't mean that you can't have it. It's just working with these things. So maybe working out before going out to a big dinner, or going for a walk, or walking home with one of your friends if you're going to a dinner or something. If you're ordering appetizer, try to order something that's higher in protein as opposed to just like eating chips or like a carbohydrate or something. Because when you get that protein in your body, then it probably takes like 10-15 more minutes to actually get your meal. Then hopefully if it does have some carbohydrates in it, you'll be able to process it better. So I hope those are helpful tips. So
definitely helpful tips. So let's touch a little bit more on NutriSense and how somebody can go about getting themselves a CGM. Like, what is the process? Is it like, if someone decides, I want one, like, what do they do?
Exactly. You can just go to our website. So it's NutriSense.io, and you can click sign up. You just have to fill out your information and register, and then you can click which subscription that you want. We have different commitment subscriptions, so 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or you can just go on a month-to-month basis. But all the programs that we offer, they do come with dietitian support. So it's complimentary for the first month that you get it. And if you do want to go beyond that month, then you can pay an additional cost. But for the most part, everyone it'll come with that initial dietitian support to help you through understanding the glucose data during the first portion of your sensor. But you can also follow us on Instagram. We're NutriSense.io. We're on Facebook as well. So anywhere where you can find us. But yeah, if you sign up for the program, then you go through all the different processes and you'll be shipped your CGMs and you can start the program.
Awesome. I highly recommend the CGM. It's another great little tool to gain some insight into your blood sugar. Again, like you say, it doesn't diagnose anything, but if you're interested in understanding how your diet is helping your blood sugar, your body, your hormones, it's just another little great tool to gain some more insight. It's a little bit of an upgrade to that the glucose meter as it's continued. But dietitian support is also definitely great for helping you understand what all that data means, because it's just a lot of data, a lot of analytics. So yeah, I highly recommend it. I have it linked in the show notes, the website and the social media. Highly recommend checking it out, following. But thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me on the podcast. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about blood sugar and just how the CGM works. And by looking through my data, it's provided people with got them interested and help educate them on blood sugar balance. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day.
Yeah, of course.